We can reverse, with the power of the people, the polarization that's choking progress and bipartisanship in government.
The thing that most threatens our democracy is gerrymandering. And it's all about, you've heard this phrase, it's about whether the people picked their representative or the representative picks the people.
But gerrymandering is everything. It is everything, because the system that we have now is a block on democracy. It's a block on effective government.
It's a problem of dysfunction within the legislature. We are unable to make decisions as a state.
It's not good for our system. And I say that as someone who's, some people say, well, you're the beneficiary of it. I'm like, no, we're all the victim of it. And I don't mean victim, partisan, Democrat, I don't mean it that way. I mean it as citizens of the Commonwealth. Our government doesn't function well because of these districts.
People draw the lines! People draw the lines!
We are going to finally make elections fair and square. Fair and square does not mean districts so cracked and packed that many general election races have no opponents. Slay the dreaded gerrymander once and for all.
Gerrymandering harms us all, but how do we change it and ensure fair maps at every election? This is an important national conversation. Some states have used citizens' initiatives to put independent redistricting commissions in place. Pennsylvania doesn't have that option. Any change needs to go through the Pennsylvania legislature, asking those who hold the power of the pen to give up that power for the benefit of voters. This is the fourth of a 6-part series provided by Fair Districts PA, a nonpartisan coalition of organizations and individuals working to ensure fair districts and fair elections for all Pennsylvanians. Fair Districts PA is a fiscal project of the League of Women Voters of Pennsylvania and an active participant in the League of Women Voters People-Powered Fair Maps initiative.
Congress, as you may have noticed, is not very popular. There are some things that people like more than Congress. 48% of people like head lice over Congress. Brussels sprouts by 46%. Colonoscopies are more popular. 27% more popular. Used car salesmen, root canals, traffic jams. Despite the fact that Congress is so unpopular, if you look at the elections in 2016, 98% of House incumbents and 93% of Senate incumbents and 80% of governors were reelected. So what does that tell you? It has to tell you something. A body full of people who are so detested are so successful in being reelected. And I would suggest, and I think it's beyond a doubt, that it has everything to do with gerrymandering districts to make so many of them safe so they almost can lose if they try. And many of them seem to try very hard. This is an astonishing thing, I think. Last year, there were all 435 seats in the United States House of Representatives were up for election. And I could have told you 6 months before the election how 400 of those district elections were going to turn out. Because there are very, very few seats anymore where the general election is really contested. It's all over in the primary. And the incumbents know in 400 out of 435 cases roughly that they're going to win. They're going to win because their districts are safe. So what does that mean? It means that in a time when our culture, our media, our politics is getting increasingly polarized, there's very little penalty anymore for being on the extremes of the right or the left. Because if you're in a safe district, you can do as wacky things as you want, you can say wacky things, you can be an extremist, you can refuse to compromise, you can spend term after term after term getting practically nothing done for the country, and you're probably going to get reelected anyway. And so, no surprise that our democracy is not working.
Now, does this matter? Do maps matter? That's a question. And people say, oh, it's just where people live. It's the way people sort themselves in our cities. Maps matter. So if you look at what happened in 2016, here's the seat to vote skew from 2016. 46% Democrat, 54% Republican. Look at how many seats the Democrats got and how many the Republicans got. That's a really big difference between votes cast and seats won. With a new map, look at what happened. Much, much more even. It's still not exactly even, but much closer. Maps do matter. And they matter for things like representation that looks like us as the people. So before 2018, Pennsylvania ranked 49th out of the 50 states for women in elected office. Only Mississippi was worse. I don't know how you feel when you see a statistic like that, but I feel sick. There's no reason that we should be in that space. As of 2019, we now have the first woman in Congress since 2014, 4 years without a woman in Congress. The first time ever that we've had more than 2 women in Congress at a time. And even so, it's still less than 25% of our congressional delegation. But it's a big change, a big jump.
Redistricting and the issue of gerrymandering remains a very, very relevant and timely topic, especially in light of some of the court cases recently, and specifically the League of Women Voters versus the Commonwealth case. The decision in that case resulted in the redrawing of the congressional districts in Pennsylvania for the 2018 and the 2020 elective cycles. However, and that's a step. However, it has no bearing whatsoever on the state legislative districts, nor does it change the process, nor does it change who is drawing the lines.
Lawsuits are at best divisive, confusing, and expensive. They are not the final solution. And they are partial and temporary remedy. Temporary because in 2021, all the lines will be drawn again after the census. And partial because it addressed the congressional districts and did nothing for our state house and senate districts. Now, the congressional districts are the ones that have had the most attention. They're the ones that are the easiest to quantify and to compare. But there are some organizations in the last year that have begun working really hard to say, well, where do state legislatures, where do they line up? Princeton Gerrymandering Project has been doing some testing on this, and according to them, there are 6 states that fail all the tests for fairness that they've run. We are one of those 6.
So the 2011 redistricting, as you know, was conducted in the same process that we've had for many, many years here in Pennsylvania. It's a process controlled by party leaders. We need a process that's controlled by citizens, and I'm so pleased that we have some of the citizen commissioners here with us from California.
California has done a couple of reforms which are important. I'll talk about the second one momentarily, but as it relates to gerrymandering, the results have been amazing.
In 2008, California passed Proposition 11, which was the Voters First Act, and that authorized the formation of a redistricting commission, a citizens redistricting commission, to do the legislative and the congressional redistricting in California.
Just to know that we had districts much like Pennsylvania's. This district here, this first one here on the left, in the yellow, was 200 miles long and was cut when the tide came in. Let's see here. Then this one, this looks very much like the one that was sort of shown in the newspaper about the Pennsylvania district around Philadelphia, and that was well, they sort of grabbed, and that was a truly gerrymandered district. Anyway, a little history. In 1990, the legislature drew maps for themselves. There was no hearings, there was no public engagement. They just drew maps. 2000 rolled around, and they drew maps again. But this was an interesting thing because it was a bipartisan gerrymander. The only criterion in 2000 was the reelection of the incumbents, and they were wildly successful.
Given the opportunity, both sides will abuse the process. The issue, if you give, it's too hard to pass up. If you give a legislator the opportunity to secure their own seats and make their own elections less competitive, they will do it every time.
Between 2002 and 2010, California had 765 elections for Assembly, Senate, and Congress. 5 seats changed hands out of 765. So obviously they did their work very well. But the public was fed up with that, frankly. The League of Women Voters and Common Cause spent a lot of time negotiating with the legislature to see if they would sort of do the right thing. No luck. So in 2008, as it was noted, Prop 11 was passed. And then in 2010, we were given the authority also over Congress, the congressional seats. And the essence of Proposition 11 was to take the power from the legislature and give it to an existing Citizens Commission. You hear people say that, well, you're not elected, you're not accountable, but that's a false choice. There is no accountability with gerrymandering because you can't get the people out of office. So there's no accountability. So the real choice is, do you want to have your maps drawn by people like you who don't have any stake in this process, or do you want to have people who absolutely will have a stake in this process? That's the real choice, and you can decide for yourself which you consider to be more accountable.
It's not going to fix itself. Given the tools available right now to politicians, it's just not going to fix itself. Which is why Fair Districts PA is proposing that Pennsylvania creates an independent commission to do redistricting. So it would take the power to create maps out of the hands of politicians and give it to the people. Politicians have an inherent conflict of interest, right? They're essentially drawing the districts to suit themselves. That's just a built-in conflict of interest. It's crazy, really, if you think about it. So think if Steelers won a Super Bowl, and then because they won a Super Bowl one year, now they're in charge of draft. Nobody would think that's a good idea. That's crazy, right? But that's exactly what's happening right now in Pennsylvania. One party won elections in a wave, and now they are taking hold on the redistricting process. So by taking the power to draw the boundaries of districts out of politicians' hands and giving them to people, we're sort of eliminating this possibility that somebody with a conflict of interest is going to be doing this.
We made a point of excluding incumbent elected officials from having any role in picking the commission. And there are, of course, a lot of states that have versions of reform that are, quote, bipartisan, unquote. Frequently, there will be selections from each half of the party structure, and then a tiebreaker in a couple of states, it's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And that avoids some of the worst problems of gerrymandering. I call it a buddy mander, though, because what happens is you can have a safe seat, if I can have a safe seat, and then we'll dole out safe seats to, and whose interests are cut out? Well, the independents, the challengers, the insurgents are not going to be at the table when the buddy mander is achieved.
Consider this. In the 10 years prior to 2012, when the new congressional districts drawn by the Independent Commission took effect, in the 10 years prior to that, there are 120 state legislative seats in California and 53 congressional seats. Okay? In the 10 years prior at the state level, 120 seats, elections every 2 years for 10 years, not one incumbent was defeated. 0. And of the 53 congressional seats, again, up every 2 years, only 2 were defeated, and both were major anomalies. One was under investigation for murder. He was cleared. It was with the affair with the intern. You might remember that story. I do want to make clear he was cleared of that. However, that was going on while he was running for office. Not helpful in a campaign, certainly. The other one went to jail for 6 years for using his seat on the Appropriations Committee to reward political contributors. Those were the 2 people who were defeated. So other than that, absent major egregious scandal, you were guaranteed re-election in California, whether you were Republican or Democrat. So then the Independent Commission takes effect. They draw the seats more fair. And of the 53 congressional seats in California, 12 of them were drawn to be competitive, relatively competitive. Now you might say, okay, 12 out of 53, that doesn't sound like very much. But it's a lot when you consider that exactly 0 were drawn to be competitive before that. Public Policy Institute of California, which is, I believe, a nonpartisan think tank out there, right? Very, very widely respected. They found that compared to other states, California has a much more moderate and consensus-building legislature, and they have moved more towards moderation. And it's important because at a time when most other states in the country, as I talked about, are moving the other direction, they're becoming more polarized, more partisan, more extreme, California has come more towards the center, in large part because of their reforms. California is now rated among the most competitive election states in the country for their municipal, for their state, and for their federal elections. That, I say, in fairness, I mean, that would have been inconceivable 10 years ago, given the national reputation that California had for partisan politics. That has changed. They have a more collegial working environment, and I think the biggest result that you can point to that shows that this reform worked is after the 2012 elections, they went from 12% approval of the legislature to 42% public approval because they see that they're working together.
I handed out a chart of the sponsors of House Bill 722. We're up to 110 co-sponsors. And as you can see, we have many Democrats and many Republicans. We have 72 Democrats, 38 Republicans. It really is a true bipartisan effort all across Pennsylvania. One other thing about 110 sponsors, that's 55% of the House of Representatives. So if this bill would come up for a vote on the House floor, I am sure that it would pass. We already have a majority of the House members who have put their names forward as co-sponsors. And in the Senate, we already have 42% of the state senators who signed on and are co-sponsors. So tremendous outpouring of support.
I believe that's the most support we've ever had in the history of Pennsylvania, at least going back to 1968 when our Constitution, our current Constitution, was adopted. Now that 1968 Constitution, you know what it includes. It includes a section that redistricting is done by 4 party leaders. And those 4 party leaders get to pick a 5th person. But you know what happens in 1970, in 1980, in 1990, in 2000, 2010. Those 4 party leaders get together and they make deals with each other. They trade territory. In my area up in the Lehigh Valley, I happen to be a Democrat. I used to represent a township that was majority Republican right next to the city of Bethlehem. 12 years ago, the party leaders in both parties took that township away from me. In their logic, it didn't make sense. The community of interest didn't make sense. My city and my township shared a school district, shared a lot of common bonds in our community. But the party leaders looked at it as an opportunity to take that township away, make my district more Democratic, make the neighboring district more Republican. They didn't ask me, and they didn't ask my Republican colleague just to the north. They just thought this was the best for their interest. So the flaw in that process, which is for our state house and state senate districts, is the current system makes sense for what's in the interest of the party leaders. We need a system that makes sense for the people of Pennsylvania.
People think this is an important issue. They're aware of it. They understand the consequences for our local democracy here in the Commonwealth. So if anyone says to you, nobody cares about this issue, they're wrong. Over half of the people in the survey across all groups said this was a very important issue for Pennsylvania. When we asked whether it was somewhat important, that number got up to 70%. So 70% is the operative number. Over 2/3 of the people found this either important or somewhat important. Another question we asked them was to give us their thoughts on who they trusted most and least to draw maps. Not surprisingly, across all groups, Republicans, African Americans, general population, Latino voters, people trusted most, guess what? Independent commissions. Who did they trust least? Incumbent elected representatives. So it's not even close. And everything else was somewhere in between. There was sort of an algorithm crowd, and there was a Supreme Court crowd, and there was a I don't know crowd. But those are the 2 takeaways in terms of whom people trusted, which to our mind is the critical question. This is about trust. You have to design and move towards a process that people trust.
Here's the story. You know, there's some folks say, why don't you just let algorithms do this? We have these high-powered computers. The problem is that in order to draw the kind of common sense maps we talked about at the outset, you actually have to have a discussion, we would suggest, among citizens about what you're trying to achieve, about how in fact you want to be represented. You can't bury that in line 74 of the code for some mysterious algorithm.
So what is transparency? Well, it's a glass window between you and the other party. No matter what you do, the other party can see what you're doing. And our entire process was very transparent. From our initial start in Northern California all the way down to San Diego, everything was publicized, everything was aired, everything was in real time. So whatever we did, whether we picked our nose or sneezed, everybody saw it. And every decision we made, whether right or wrong, we got corrected. People called in, they Instagrammed us, they sent emails, they Twittered us saying, have you considered this? Have you considered that? And we took those inputs, that information, as part of our deliberations and made the best decisions we felt reflected what these communities in different parts of California wanted to see in their area. I say that because these issues are not partisan issues. These are issues that are important to communities. And the citizens that we took public testimony from told us what was important to them in terms of economics, social issues, histories, what their beliefs and their values are. And that was important for us to try to determine then what is the proper definition of a boundary that reflects those communities' values. And in the end, I think when we went through this process, we did not realize that we were generating an enormous amount of confidence and trust in the public from what they were seeing. So halfway through our public process, we noticed that the public input was building up. So we had a momentum going that just got larger and larger and larger. And that's an important lesson to learn, because what we realized at that point is that the public was beginning to believe that there was a genuine body that was willing to listen to their voices. And if they came and voiced their opinion, those 14 peoples would take that input and consider it. And I think that's a lesson to learn everywhere, even in Pennsylvania, that it's ordinary people, just like you, that can make a huge difference in building that momentum.
We had to entirely build our infrastructure. Everything that we did was live streamed, as I guess we are being now. Fully transparent process that followed ranked criteria set out in our law. We came in on time, under budget, and we demonstrated that regular citizens can do redistricting in a fair and transparent manner without self-interest. Regular citizens, just like the people in the legislature who once were regular citizens. They learned to do it, so can you. The 2012 results, as Jason Altmeyer pointed out, were extraordinary. Although we were not charged with drawing competitive districts, when you draw them fairly, clearly it gives people an opportunity to compete. And we had a lot of big changes at that time.
We have some standards and criteria that are already in our state constitution for compactness, contiguity, and respect for political boundaries, counties, and municipalities. And those have been accepted. They've been in the Constitution for a long time as they apply to state legislative districts. And our state Supreme Court adopted those standards for congressional districts when they drew the new map, the new congressional map.
When you consider all of those factors and all of those criteria, you naturally get competitive districts. And so I think competitiveness comes out of those other criteria that are established.
Yeah. Jessica's exactly right. Now, just make the point that we did not, the commission did not create the criteria. We did not decide, oh, let's look at this or that. Ours was set out in ranked order in the law. And by following that ranked order very carefully, we were upheld several times over in the courts when we were challenged.
I will always have in my head a set of stories from that from that campaign across Pennsylvania. The woman in Clark Summit who said, when you changed my congressional district, all of a sudden it took me 2 hours to drive to my district office if I had an issue. The folks in Indiana, Pennsylvania, who I learned that Philadelphia Street bisects the downtown of Indiana, and that seemingly that also was the dividing line between two districts, which makes no sense whatsoever.
A place called Creed's Seafood and Steaks out in Montgomery County. So the 7th district it actually narrows down to this restaurant and then broadens back out again. Another one is Brandywine Gastrointestinal Associates, which is an endoscopy center.
There was sort of an informal competition between, I'll say, the folks in Erie County, Berks County, Montgomery County, Northampton County, about who had been sliced and diced most egregiously in the last round of redistricting. So, and there's some great horror stories. Maybe in the most compelling fashion, I remember a gentleman from Sudbury saying, this process, as I've learned about it, the cynicism and the hyper-partisanship and the to the victor go the spoils mentality hurts my civic soul. And at a time, let's just say, when we are grasping for ways to remember the beauty and strength of the American experiment, his comment hurt my civic soul.
It's remarkable to me, and I think our greatest achievement, that we were able to bring 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and 4 independents who were complete strangers to each other together, to work together in a collaborative manner to achieve fair results for the people of California.
I think the key for our success is trust, public trust. Ultimately, these maps have to be bought and by the communities, and they have to understand why they were drawn that way. If you don't have the public's trust behind those maps, it's going to be problematic down the line, but you need the trust.
Now therefore be it resolved that the Clinton County Board of Commissioners does hereby affirm its support for timely action, which may include an independent Citizens Redistricting Commission.
Through a unanimous vote of my commissioner colleagues and I, became the very first county in Pennsylvania to support the reform needed to extricate the politicians from choosing their voters.
Take action now in this legislative session. We need it. We did not believe, I do not believe, that the Supreme Court was a resolution to this problem. It's a temporary measure. We need to do it right, and we need to do it completely.
There are so many more people who can be involved in this movement, and so many more people that can make an impact. I'm talking about a critical mass of individuals armed with the knowledge of what gerrymandering is and this impact on our democracy.
Thank you all for exercising your right.
The fight for reform continues, with bills introduced and blocked, and new bills introduced. Find out the latest about legislative strategy and how you can help at fairdistrictspa.com and sign the petition for change.